Hopefully that's the first slide. Well, thanks everyone. I'm going to give you what I see as a user's perspective on access and benefit sharing and try and explain what that is and why it's important for researchers. And it'll be particularly a Queensland perspective, I suppose, but I'm going to try and put it in the context of some of the issues as I see them being different elsewhere. First slide's got a few of the plant species that I'm interested in collecting from, and I think these are all effectively wild crop relatives from Queensland. So I've really been interested in capturing biodiversity for human use, and I've really worked systematically through all the groups of flowering plants, trying to identify which ones we can use and which ones we can't use and which ones we might have overlooked that could be used. So, why do we actually need to access biodiversity, or particularly in my case, plant biodiversity? And I guess I've got three motivations. One's food security. Australia is a major centre for diversity of food plants. Secondly, energy security, and I'm interested in replacing fossil fuels with plant-based materials, and I'm currently acting as a consultant for the new bioenergy roadmap for Australia for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. And particularly also in terms of supporting conservation of biodiversity. Really, we need to access it if we're going to understand it and do the research that we need to support its conservation. So just to illustrate those three applications, we can be looking at crop relatives like the grapes and rice depicted here, grapes and rice, or some of the native species like Davidsonia and Hicksbeechia that were depicted here that represent effectively new crops that we can get by accessing biodiversity. We can also think though about how we can use plants as a source of carbon to replace the use of fossil fuels, and that's a really key way of dealing with climate change into the future. And it does require that we have access to the right plants to do that. And also, this is one of the plants I'm particularly concerned about from a conservation point of view. That's potentially, because it's very rare, is at risk from things like frequent fires and so forth. And we really need to have access to these resources to study them, to be able to put in place the management practices to conserve them. So when it comes to the question of benefit sharing, there's a number of questions, I suppose. The first question is, who owns these biological resources that we're wanting to access for research, commercial or conservation purposes? And how do we share the benefits that we get when we do access them? And how do we deal with these, including how do we deal with the non-monetary benefits? So the benefits of working with biodiversity are not just in dollars, they're quite often other things. There's benefits to the environment, benefits to society, and there's issues about sharing those. I'd like to begin the explanation of the importance of benefit sharing and access by starting with the foundations of agriculture. And this is a picture of the citadel in Aleppo, and the grasses on the side here are wild barleys. Here's a close-up of it. And barley was that first plant we think was domesticated that led to agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And I've recently been involved in a study of trying to work out exactly where that happened. Traditionally, we thought of it happening in the Middle East, where we've got these green things here. I'm hoping you can see my pointer. But there's been an alternative view that's come from some of the work that one of my PhD students did many years ago that suggests that there might be a secondary origin or another source of domestication in Tibet. And this is a case where people in China have been particularly keen to claim ownership of an organism, and where there's been real interest in how this happened. Looking at the DNA of all of these samples just recently with large groups in China and in Germany, we've identified that barley really was domesticated here about 10,000 years ago, and then was taken across through India and into Tibet and grown there about 5,000 years ago, and then escaped into the wild. So we're now able to tell the story about the origins here, but we had two competing options. Barley could have been domesticated maybe in northern Syria, or it could have been in Tibet. And of course, that would mean that the sort of traditional owners or the people that we needed to deal with around this would be either the Syrian government or the Chinese government, and very, very different options. But is a case where we need science to sort it out. But what it's illustrating is that a lot of these things happened a long time ago. So if we think about human interactions with our biodiversity, there's a couple of popular books that I feel that really have been useful for society in understanding this. People like Jared Diamond, who's at University of California, Davis, has really set out the history of human societal development in association with agriculture and food, but also in association with pandemics and the implications of disease in human populations. So it's actually a really good account. One of the things that Jared Diamond, in a number of his books, comments on is the failure of agriculture to develop in Australia, the apparent lack of agriculture in Australia. And then, of course, most recently, we have Bruce Pascoe's book, The Dark Emu, which provides in some ways the answer to that by suggesting that there really was a form of agricultural food production in Australia that probably explains the apparent maybe misconception about how food was produced in this country. So the interaction between society and biodiversity has a long history, and a particularly interesting history in Australia. And I work with wild plant populations in places like Cape York, and here on Cape York, close to where we do collections, we see Indigenous art like this, and this particular work is about 11,000 years old. So here we've got Indigenous art from a time before there was agriculture, even in the Middle East. So we've got real questions about food production and human engagement with our biodiversity going back a very long way in this country. So there are some really interesting issues that we're aiming to get science to address about understanding those relationships by looking a lot more at the biology of our current plant populations. Now, before starting to talk just about the legal aspects, or I'm not going to talk about the legal aspects really, so this is not a safe harbor statement, but because a safe harbor statement is normally saying don't act on this advice and don't invest on this advice, but I'm basically saying don't believe in anything I say from a legal point of view, or don't act on it. Please get the appropriate advice about how you should do your collections and what's legitimate and what's not. All I'm giving you is a scientist perspective, and I'm just going to give you some of my experiences of dealing with the regulatory environment and trying to come to terms with how to do this in the right way. So, and access and benefit sharing to biodiversity in Queensland particularly, but anywhere, is driven by or controlled by international treaties particularly, and by local laws and various combinations of those. And I would start by just saying a bit about the Convention on Biodiversity. I think many of us probably are aware of this. This was based on a meeting held in Rio de Janeiro in the early 1990s. And at this meeting, countries reached agreement about ownership of biodiversity and basically gave states the right to claim ownership of their own biological resources. Before this time, there was a common philosophy that biodiversity was the common heritage of humanity and it belonged to all of us, so that there was no ownership of material. And many countries, particularly was particularly strong view held by some, I think, of South American countries and countries that were rich in biodiversity, that they weren't getting an adequate return on that biodiversity, and that really large multinational corporations were coming and taking away their biological resources, and they weren't getting any compensation for it. And so this agreement allowed countries to claim ownership and control access to their biological resources. So in Queensland, and it's important to understand that a state, as determined by the Biodiversity Convention, is a state in Australia, like Queensland or New South Wales. It's not Australia. Even though Australia signed the International Convention, our federal law gives the power to control biodiversity to the states. So in each case, you're dealing with a state, and in Australia, every state is different. So the rules for access and benefit sharing in one state are almost unrelated to what they are in another. But this has all been enabled by the Convention on Biodiversity. And Queensland is really a first mover here. There was some model federal legislation that really hasn't been followed by the other states. Queensland created this BioDiscovery Act, but states like New South Wales have not acted. So if you discover something in the wild in New South Wales, the government is not interested in it. If you do it in Queensland, the Queensland government will claim they own it, and you will need to license access. Very different situation. So I've experienced people coming to me wanting to know about distribution of plants from Queensland that might extend into New South Wales, so that they can collect them in New South Wales and avoid the Queensland legislation. And so we do have those anomalies. I would certainly advocate that we need to move towards uniform legislation, but I can imagine that's something that could take a very long time. And the next thing that I need you to be aware of in thinking about this is that really the Biodiversity Convention didn't work well for major food crops, staple food crops. The Food and Agriculture Organization spent a lot of time negotiating a new arrangement, a treaty that it provided for staple food crops to be freely exchanged. What was the cause for concern was that countries could potentially say you can't have access to rice or wheat or some other product because it's our genetic resource. We claim it under the Convention on Biodiversity, but it was recognized that really these staple foodstuffs were more in the category of things that were common assets of the international community, and that there was a need to share them. So this requires sharing of genetic resources for crops that are scheduled under the treaty, and you need to share them under a multilateral benefit sharing agreement, as opposed to the bilateral agreement with the state government you would have for collecting material in Queensland. So this is the first level or layer of complexity in the arrangements. And Australia, of course, has signed up to this, and much of the work that we do with major crops is controlled by the FAO Treaty, which basically reverses the onus of the Convention on Biodiversity by requiring you to exchange material, but requiring the ultimate commercialiser to pay a royalty not to the state government as it would do under the Biodiversity Act, but to the FAO for sharing potentially to multiple contributors to the genetics of a variety that might be released by a commercial company. And rice is a good example. I just wanted to say a little bit about our work on rice. We've been working with rice across this quite wide area, and accessing material in Australia is one thing, accessing it outside is another. But rice is one of those species that is controlled by the FAO Treaty, and that's quite important. It's a native plant, quite widespread in Australia. And so the dilemma we've had is that the BioDiscovery Act in Queensland says we must only work with native species under an arrangement with the state. The FAO Treaty says we must share this material and only work with it under a multilateral arrangement. This is not resolved, but we're expecting that the current revisions of the State Biodiscovery Act may recognise this anomaly and exempt these species like this from the provisions of the Biodiscovery Act, so that we can actually work with rice under the treaty rather than the Convention on Biodiversity. So we're working with all of that diversity. We've collected over this area, for example, on Cape York, and those collections were done historically. So they were done a number of years ago, before the enforcement of the more recent provisions of the Biodiscovery Act. And we've only done one collection since we've aligned with the Biodiscovery Act and the treaty, and that's and so these collections over this area have involved working with Indigenous people under scientific collection permits. So we did have in Queensland ability to do that in the past, we're now, I think, increasingly expected to align with the Biodiscovery Act and with, of course, the treaty. So that means that historical collections like this are not so easy. I'll just then jump ahead to say that the further refinement of all of this has come with the Nagoya Protocol. Now, this is a set of international laws that created, I suppose, the greatest interest in recent times. This requires that any use of material, genetic resources, have prior informed consent from relevant Indigenous groups, and that be on mutually agreed terms. So you need both the pick and the mat, as we say. And this protocol has potentially far-reaching implications. What we're seeing is that food companies, for example, in Europe, may be insisting on adherence to this protocol for the purchase of food. So if we want to sell Australian agricultural products in Europe, we're going to increasingly have to have abided by Nagoya. Now, Brad Sherman, I think, has joined the meeting. I see Brad is with us, has worked with us to understand some of this, and we've got an article coming out in Nature Plants, probably in the next issue, saying something about the Nagoya Protocol and particularly historical collections. And so while the Nagoya Protocol is a great concept, there are a number of problems in trying to apply it that it's worth talking about. And they particularly relate to historical plant material. So if that historical plant material is covered by an international access and benefit sharing agreement, and that is if it's covered by the FAO Treaty, then we have a path to utilizing it, because Nagoya Protocol recognizes that material handled in accordance with the treaty is in fact compliant with the Nagoya Protocols. So that gives us effectively not so much a loophole, but a pathway to work with species that are listed in Annex 1 of the Plant Treaty and to consider them Nagoya compliant. If they're not covered by that, and this is where we've got a lot of species that we're challenged with working with, then it depends on the particular interpretation of the Nagoya Treaty in the country in which you're working or the country in which you might sell the product. And it's possible for this to be either prospective or retrospective. So where Nagoya is retrospective, there's an expectation that you will always have complied with the protocol. It's one thing to say we will be Nagoya compliant in new collections that we make, but it's essentially impossible to say I'm going to be Nagoya compliant with the seed bank, material from the seed bank which was collected 100 years ago, or with plant material that was domesticated 1,000 years ago. And so the sort of crops that are really challenging in agriculture are those that are not listed in Annex 1 of the FAO Treaty. All of these species, for example, where you need to establish Nagoya compliance in its own right, essentially for historical material in countries where Nagoya is retrospective. So this includes some fairly major species for which, in a sense, we can't access seed banks or genetic resource collections in a way that's compliant with the Nagoya Treaty. And so I've suggested that this is the person that we need as a collaborator. We need Dr. Who to come along and take us back so that we can get that prior informed consent. Now, this obviously isn't possible. So we do have a challenge in finding a way forward with whole groups of plants that the Nagoya Protocol can't easily be applied to retrospectively, because we can't go and negotiate. There's no real way of, in many cases, even identifying who the current descendants would be of the people that were relevant thousands of years ago. So it is a very problematical area. One of the cases, a real case that I can relate where this has come up, has been our sequencing of the sorghum genus. We have a project with the Joint Genome Institute in the US to sequence all of the species in the sorghum genome and to understand the evolution of this genus. And we've had a request to establish Nagoya compliance of our samples before they'll be accepted by the University of California, Davis. The institution has declared itself Nagoya compliant as a matter of policy. And that implication of that is that they won't deal with a sample that doesn't meet the Nagoya Protocols. Now, in the case of sorghum, we're fortunate because sorghum is actually listed in Annex 1 of the treaty. So by insisting that the University of California work with us in a way that's compliant with the FAO Treaty, we've managed to satisfy their requirements for the Nagoya Protocol, and hence they've been able to accept our samples and do the DNA sequencing. But increasingly, this will be a problem for handling samples, particularly between countries where there'll be these requirements. Now, for other species, we don't necessarily have the same easy path because, for example, they might not be listed in Annex 1 of the FAO Treaty. This was a pretty interesting challenge because University of California, Davis doesn't seem to have ever signed the standard material transfer agreement that's required to operate under the treaty. And of course, without operating under the treaty, they can't be Nagoya compliant. So we've spent up some time toing and froing with their lawyers to get them to understand the legal implications of their own policy for the fact that they would have to be able to sign a standard material transfer agreement to be compliant. So just to indicate broad progress that we've made as an institution, the University of Queensland signed a benefit sharing agreement with the state government in 2019 as an umbrella arrangement that governs the benefit sharing that will occur under the conventional biodiversity. And there are a number of biodiscovery plans. The benefit sharing agreement requires that a biodiscovery plan be produced for each experiment or project that's going to be conducted that involves collection of biological material in Queensland. I've been involved in generating 2 biodiscovery plans, one for Jerboisia that was approved in 2019 and one for rice in 2020. I know the university has a number of other biodiscovery plans that are in preparation or may already be signed off, but you will need one of these at the moment for each project. It is proposed that the revised BioDiscovery Act may eliminate this step and require just the benefit sharing agreement and then a collection agreement. Because when you've got your benefit sharing agreement, you've got your biodiscovery plan, you then need approval to collect. You need collection permits. And the Jerboisia we're working out with is a plant that's important from a pharmaceutical drug point of view. And of course, rice is important as an agricultural crop plant. What you need is collection permits, and in Queensland, at the moment, the Biodiscovery Act only relates to public land, but the view is that in revisions, it will be extended to cover all land, whether it's private or public. So at the moment, if we're collecting on freehold land, then we need approval of the landowner. All other lands, we need government approval, and the Biodiscovery Act controls what we do. Just to let you know, 60% of Queensland is public land. Leasehold land is public land, so it's the only land that's not public land is freehold land. So much of the pastoral areas, much of the agricultural land we work with, where there's 60% of the land area, public land. Roadsides are a particularly challenging area to collect because on the roadside, you need to understand the authority. In many areas, you need further approval from the local council to collect. And if it's a main road, you need approval from the main roads department to collect. So that's in addition to all the other approvals you might need from the benefit sharing agreement through the biodiscovery plan to the standard collection permit. So roadsides are particularly interesting because quite often the plant's growing right on the fence line. So you don't know whether you've got to actually find a plant that's either inside the field, which might mean negotiating with the landowner, or on the roadside, which means with the main roads department. So the other perspective is to is that many people think that this doesn't apply to me because I'm doing research. Well, I suppose the initial concept of this is about commercial use, but the reality is, in certainly my dealings with regulators, they're not prepared to accept that that there's any sort of exemption for even fairly fundamental studies, because there's no way you can guarantee there'll be nothing useful come from your research. There potentially, all research is commercial in these terms, I believe, because even any sort of fundamental study, if you're going out and collecting plants to study their evolutionary biology, you may discover something that combats COVID-19 in the material, and of course you'd have the responsibility to see that utilized. So the view is that you need a benefit sharing agreement, essentially just in case there's a commercial outcome. And other case studies that I'm currently involved with: macadamia, coffee, citrus, eucalypts, pigeon pea rainforests. The macadamias are a particularly challenging example because here, you know, this is a species that's local, was taken to Hawaii 100 years ago, brought back here. Who owns this material? Very challenging because of the movement between countries, as well as the relatively recent involvement. And we're working on a rare species here. And the way we're accessing this is because we're using an historical collection. We're not being Nagoya compliant. We can't pretend to be, but we are observing the Biodiscovery Act by working, not collecting any of this material in the wild. Similarly, we're working with wild coffee. Again, we're working with historical collections, material collected by Darren Crane and the Tropical Herbarium some time ago. We haven't got a permit to collect in the wild. Citrus, we're working with commercial native citrus species. So we're working with all 6 of the Australian indigenous species, but using only commercial material, no wild collections, because we haven't attempted the regulatory pathway yet. Eucalypts, very much in the same category. We're working on the sequence of the spotted gums locally, using material from gardens and from commercial forestry collections, not yet in a position to develop a plan for approval for collection in the wild. Pigeon pea, the same, really important genetic resources here for new protein sources in the wild, working with historical collections. And we're working with the rainforest species, looking at evolution of the rainforests and the genetics of those. And the way we're dealing with that at the moment is we're working with material from New South Wales. The Sydney Herbarium is doing collections, and so we're not, at this stage, found it necessary to embark upon what would be a very major process of getting approval to collect rainforest in Queensland. So I think we're also looking at opportunities to domesticate new crops. Here we are going through the regulatory process. But one of the final points I wanted to mention was this concept of dematerialization. The control of access and benefit sharing applies to the biological material, but increasingly there's a move internationally to make it deal with what's thought of as the dematerialized biological material. So to deal with the sequence data or other data. So I may not be able to share a seed sample with you, but some people say, well, I'll sequence the gene and send you the sequence by email. The increasing view is that material also should be controlled by the same regulations, so that this is potentially challenging for basic biological research, because we'll have to understand that we will have restrictions on sharing of data about biological material. And particularly, in my case, I'm interested in the molecular data. We've now got a program on the genomics of the Australian flora. We're hoping to get sequences of all Australian plants. So we're going to have to work out how to deal with all of this if that's actually going to get there. We're going to have a major meeting on this, on crop domestication and use of biological resources in Australia worldwide in Brisbane late next year. And there we're hoping to have quite a few forums to talk about how we address these rather complex issues. I'll just end by acknowledging all the many partners we've got in this ongoing exercise. So I think I'll stop there and be ready to take questions. Melissa?
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. Can everyone find the clap feature of your screen if you go into reactions? We can give Robert a hand for his presentation. And now, Robert, could you stop sharing your screen so then we can see who might have questions? Maybe I can do it for you. I'll see if I can.
See if I can do it. Stop share, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, if anyone has a question, if you raise your hand using the Zoom function, that would be good. And if you don't know how to do that, just maybe put your camera on and raise your hand, and then I'll invite you to ask a question. Does the thumb in the air mean your hand's raised? Annie, have you got a question, or are you just thumbs up?
No, I'm sorry, I don't have a question. I hit the wrong thing, but it was a good thumbs up, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Bob, do you have a question?
Yes, I tried to give a raised hand. G'day. Excellent, Robert. That's a really fine presentation. Something, of course, which you're aware, but other people may not, through our project looking at Australian wild rices, and something that I did, which I could do because of my affiliation with China, was to look at the possibility of working with with Indigenous people in the territory by going through a friend a former student who's Indigenous. I got hold of him and said, hey, Stephen, would you be interested in seeing what could be done? And we got a territory lawyer. We did what could be done through territory law, and he worked through the elders of his tribe, and in fact created a company where he was director to handle all this. But we ended up finding the whole thing was so contradictory, such a mess. The net outcome was we gave up something that could have been of benefit to Indigenous people because of the contradictions and so on that you've laid out. It stops benefit for Indigenous people. It's insane.
Yes. So probably
comments on that.
Yeah. So I'd agree. I mean, obviously, if these sort of rules stop things happening, if they stop commercialization, if they stop use of biological resources, there's effectively no benefit to share. So we do need to find a way to simplify these arrangements such that we can generate, we can work with stop science if we can't access the biological material, and it stops environmental benefits that flow from a lot of this. So there's all sorts of reasons why we need to find a way through all of this. And you're right, there's lots of contradictions. There's lots of the Queensland Bio-discovery Act completely contradicts the Food and Agriculture Organisation Treaty, because the people drafting that legislation were not aware of the existence of the treaty. Now that we've drawn them to their attention, they will eventually put an exemption for treaty species in the Biodiscovery Act. But generally, these sort of contradictions are quite widespread. What we've got to do is find a way forward. I think you raise an important point. I think the Northern Territory is actually, I think, very difficult. Queensland is challenging, but Northern Territory is harder. Their legislation's much more, I think, requiring that you actually reach a commercial agreement before you get a collection opportunity to collect for commercial purposes. Quite onerous requirements on having a commercial arrangement in place. Normally, when we're doing research, we have to discover what it is we've got before we know how to commercialize it. But in the Northern Territory, it tends to reverse that onus in a way that makes it actually quite difficult. And I've heard the same from many people attempting to do research in that jurisdiction.
Okay, do we have another question? Bronwyn.
I haven't got a question as such, more a statement that on the complications, that I just want to remind people that it wasn't Indigenous people that created the complications. In fact, it was non-Indigenous people around issues, whether they're in discipline or not, across a range of disciplines actually, who created some of these issues, which in some ways are designed to protect Indigenous communities, but also have worked against some Indigenous communities. In regards to those, that doesn't mean, and I'm one to support to say, at this time, some of those issues we need a process to work through rather than to abandon what is there and scratch, because we cannot go back to the practices that may have happened earlier on, where it was free for all, where people just took and communities got very little payback or rewards for themselves in terms of the knowledges or that material that was on their land. So I acknowledge it's complicated, I acknowledge it's difficult, but we also have to work towards improving a system that has been constructed over and above all of us by probably some of the people that you've worked with, Robert and Bob and maybe others, or people that worked in this area and people that are in government, have been in government long before any of us. So I think we've got to acknowledge that too. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what you're saying about the fact that we shouldn't let, Indigenous people have really had nothing to do with the complication here, and we certainly shouldn't let the complexity of it stop us trying to make things happen. We've got to find a way forward so we can do things and we can get benefits and we can see them shared appropriately.
That's correct. Yeah.
We've got to have that positive attitude despite the complexity, but we've got to help people to understand the complexity and find their way through it in a positive way. I know Brad, Chairman, might like to comment. Brad's certainly sort of suggesting more solutions to these general problems. I don't know whether, Brad, you want to share your philosophy about the solution to these sort of problems certainly from a legal scientific point of view.
Okay, I can have a go. Thanks, Robert. I think there are two general issues at present. One is the one that you and Bronwyn have alluded to, which is sort of the bureaucratic issues that arise. And that hopefully is being dealt with, I suppose the three issues, that hopefully is being dealt with as things get reformed. The second thing at the moment is that because there's not uniform protection across Australia, people can forum shop. So when Mary Kay took out the patent on the Kakadu plum in 2010, initially there was a suggestion that they collected it in the Northern Territory, and then people asked the question, well, where is the appropriate benefit sharing? They then issued a statement to clarify that they in fact had collected the material from some of the New South Wales, and all their subsequent patents state that the material is collected in New South Wales, in brackets, not in Queensland or Northern Territory or on Commonwealth areas. So there's no need for them to enter into benefit sharing agreements. So that's a loophole that needs to be fixed. The third issue that Robert's already alluded to is the question of historical collections. And there's a great deal of uncertainty at the moment about what can be done with those collections. And Robert and I are beginning to work on a potential solution, which is getting a common understanding of people who work with these materials. And so hopefully we'll say, for example, work with Nature Publishing, who are making it a requirement of authors to be Nagoya compliant, that they can also issue a statement saying, Nagoya compliance means in historical collections, you've made, say, for example, best practice in order to identify the authors, or the parties who provided initial access to the materials, and where that doesn't occur, then you use the standard material transfer agreement under the Plant Treaty, and the money goes back into a common fund to be shared equally. So there's sort of three issues I think that we're dealing with.
Yeah, so I think Brad's advocating that as a sort of research community, that we really need to be starting to develop some of our own codes of practice, if you like, as to how we're going to ethically deal with material in these areas, with the hope that we can find a way that allows us to move forward and generate progress in these areas, and over time encourage the regulatory environment to in effect probably adopt some of the practices that we identify as good practice in this area. I think, Brad, you've cited other legal precedent for that sort of thing happening.
Yeah, that's correct. So, for example, in the beginning part of the 20th century, when people were beginning to reproduce materials from scientific journals, there was questions that arose about sort of the copyright problems. Most of the journals were run by learned societies, so the mathematical journals were by the Royal Society of Mathematics, etc., etc. What the societies did was to strike an agreement with their members that anybody, it was called the Gentleman's Agreement, which reflects very much the time. It was 1913 it was passed, and agreements were struck with the publishing houses and the members that allowed people to take one copy of one article from a journal for their own purposes. And that was developed by scientists working together to find a solution to a problem. And then it was adopted, and that's now embodied in copyright law around the world in library copying exceptions. And we now have inherited in terms of when you photocopy, the statutory license that we used to see sort of stuck on photocopy machines around universities. But there is a scope for universities to lead the way here, to develop best practice. And I hope that UQ could be, at the forefront of that nationally and hopefully internationally, to establish best practice and then to clarify what that best practice is. So hopefully maybe Bronwyn, it's something we could work on in the future as an institution.
Yeah, I hope so. In terms of getting that together, and I think it's not necessarily us leading on our own, it's leading with others around in the work in this space. So yeah, definitely. Not about my office leading it either.
No, we've connected into a number of international groups, and I think what we're thinking of is bringing some of them maybe here to to Brisbane and having some workshops to try and get a broader international perspective on particularly things like Nagoya, so that we've got to bring the whole world with us on this.
I think in that space, it's about bringing people in from around the world, but it's bringing Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who work in the space around the world.
Yes.
Can't be just science people or researchers. It also needs to be how Indigenous people managing this around the world, because it's problematic in parts of the US, it's problematic in parts of South America, and other parts of the world. So it'd be good to hear from them too about how they're managing and how they're navigating.
Yes.
And what kind of agreements exist, and how does that fit in with the international work, but also best practice in the international work and the standards that are espoused in the international work that also uphold Indigenous rights.
Yep.
Because part of this is, there's what people have to do in terms of the rules and whatever, but there's also, I'll say here, there's what's morally right as well for people to do, which sometimes we haven't seen go together or not exist in parallel. And that's where we are judged, all of us here who are working in this area, or whether people are working in other areas around animals, or whether they're working in, other areas around plants with food, or whether they're working in other things with objects as well that they find on country. It's about how we get judged in 50 years' time in the same way that we can judge those researchers and scientists and anthropologists and botanists and linguists and everyone else that collected things 50 years ago, or indeed 100 years ago. Yeah,
I think that's a very important point, that it's not just the letter of the law, it's actually getting the right ethical and moral outcome. And so often the law doesn't help us there. So I think the sort of philosophy that Brad and I have been trying to put together is to get scientists to come up with that more ethical framework to put alongside whatever the law might have to say on the matter.
Yeah, because like, you know, we're dealing with stuff at the moment at UQ and other universities are in big museums and collections around the world about repatriation of remains. Well, as has been revealed, some of those remains were obtained through what they used to call the old bone collectors, you know, people going digging up Aboriginal graves, whether it was in Australia or, you know, graves in parts of New Guinea and other places. And those were remains were gained through swapping of remains and things like that. We got to remember as they're people's ancestors. And so we're now having to try and make those things right. So we don't want to be, you know, part of it's about considering are there any ethical dilemmas with any of this as well. Because, you know, as you said, and I've alluded to, you know, some of this fits with what you have to do, and these are bare minimums in terms of rules and regulations and acts and policies. But what is also the minimum and what is even better or great to do? Sometimes there is no better or great known at this time because it hasn't been navigated and there's no examples. But what could be great that we as UQ can also role model and lead and also publish about. This is the minimum, but this is what we're doing on top of that, because we also think in consultation that this is better practice than the bare minimum.
Yep.
And we find that you can find examples of that across all disciplines.
Yes.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, it's Craig here. I couldn't work out how to put up my hand. I guess I'm interested from a pragmatic current view of what is possible and what is not possible. So, I mean, I can understand it's extremely complex, but, you know, we've got situations where we've got, well, you know, we can take macadamia as an example, but we've got a whole lot of layers to that of, you know, what should, you know, what can't we do? Well, what shouldn't we do now while we are uncertain about something, and, you know, and maybe that was resolved later, and what is the opportunities we can undertake now?
Yeah, there's no simple answer, unfortunately, Craig. That's why we want to see more work happen so that people in your situation do have a clear path to move forward. The macadamia is particularly challenging, and Brad and I have got a research proposal we've put up to study macadamia to try and, you know, to understand all the issues around access and benefit sharing for something like that. It's clearly safer to work with, in some ways, with historical collections and not go out and collect new material until we're clear about some of these things. But the historical collections are not free from these issues. So it's just that they were collected in the past. So we do have to address them, and it will require all the processes that Bronwyn talked about of working out, you know, what is a reasonable and ethical way to work with something like macadamia, setting aside even the law for a moment, and then trying to reconcile that within the sort of local and international legal frameworks that we've got to work with, even when some of those rules are somewhat, or as Bob's pointed out, quite highly contradictory at times in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So I don't know, Brad, whether you've got a specific answer for Craig, but unfortunately, I don't think we've got one.
No. Well, I do. It depends.
That's what a lawyer always says, isn't it? It depends.
So if it was collected in Queensland and it was collected now and it was on state land, then it would have to be covered by the current Queensland Bio-discovery Act.
Yes.
If it was collected in New South Wales, you just have to get the permission of the landowner, or whatever they may require of you. If it's from the historical collection or one of the living collections, and you're working on something, then you want to export the material that you're working on to University of California, Davis, you would have to show it as Nagoya compliant. And that's what's going to become the best practice. In that situation, you'd have to show that you have a benefit sharing agreement with the access provider, so you'd have to know who that person was, and it was collected 100 years ago or 50 or 20 years ago, they may no longer be around, and it's highly unlikely. They're probably just taken with no documentation whatsoever. So we'll always depend upon the particular scenario.
Yes, because macadamia is not an Annex 1 of the treaty, I think historical collections of macadamia are just too hard to make Nagoya compliant at the moment. We haven't got an answer. We can clearly make new collections Nagoya compliant by going through the whole processes of, and that in a sense is an easier path, because the historical ones we just don't have a solution for prospective Nagoya jurisdictions. One of the things that Brad mentioned earlier, the Kakadu plum. I mean, claiming that you got your Kakadu plum from New South Wales clearly might get you away legally, but no scientist is going to believe that, because these things don't grow in New South Wales. It's a convenient legal environment in saying which you found it, so that you're outside the Queensland and Northern Territory Acts, but it can't be true. So we don't want to get involved in those sorts of, I guess, rearranging the truth to try and get outside the law here. That's pretty important that we don't go down any of those sort of paths.
Any other questions? I might take the opportunity to ask a quick one.
Right.
So, Robert, you used the example of rice.
Yep.
And having that on Annex 1 of the treaty,
Mm.
and that therefore that being Nagoya compliant.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about, say, the Australian wild rices from northern Queensland, that legally would be Nagoya compliant.
Yes.
Ethically,
but maybe not ethically. You're right. Yes.
they're absolutely not.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that comes down then to the interpretation of the Nagoya Protocol, doesn't it? And that comes down to us thinking about then how we might.
So you're right. So that's a very important point to say. Because a rise or a rice is on the treaty, we've got a path there to saying if we follow the requirements of the treaty and we actually get a collection permit from the government, and then whoever commercializes it pays a royalty into the multilateral system, that we're technically Nagoya compliant. But really, my view is that in an ethical sense, we should also be doing the genuine negotiation with the Indigenous people in those areas, and actually getting prior informed consent from them, and trying to get them to participate in the commercialization. So certainly the approach that I'm taking is to tick all the legal boxes, but then to try and also engage with the Indigenous people such that there actually is a genuine process of engagement around access and benefit sharing. Because I think one doesn't satisfy the other, and that was Bronwyn's point. I think very, very important point.
Yeah, I think
my issue is that people have been sometimes working around these, or just saying we have the legal right, and in the process do Indigenous people over, including those Indigenous people who are the traditional owners, and some may still live on that land, for profitability and commercialisation and ongoing profitability for their families and everyone else who benefits, and Indigenous people getting nothing, and still remaining in the same situation in that community and living in poverty. Perhaps they are. We have the same issue where, I was in a conversation, it was about 6 weeks ago, where people documented the economic benefits gained from farming and from cattle. But now it just takes a whole lot of other forms of farming. So one is a farming of seeds, and, they meaning taking crops or taking bits and pieces of land and whatever. So, there's elements of ethics around this, and philosophy, and also morality, morals, that they're prepared to let that happen. So what is, even if people can't reach some form of agreement, there's a process in commercialisation where the monies can be gifted into funds and things. And we've seen that overseas, where groups will say, well, we're not taking those cash benefits of the profit can go into a general Indigenous fund where there are no clear Indigenous land traditional owners. So anyway, I'll say enough about that's enough I've said there.
So that brought me to a second question. So you said, Robert, that you you're working with Indigenous people for access to these wild rices. How do you go about finding the traditional owners to work with?
Well, I think that's one of the big challenges here, and what we need, I think, this is a discussion I think I've had with Brad and others, is how do we develop an ethical process for doing that even? How do we it can't just be the first Indigenous person you meet. There's got to be a better process than that. So there's a whole lot of issues there. One of the really challenging ones is for very widespread species. The species might occur on lots of different Indigenous areas. We don't want the situation where people can cherry pick and go to the Indigenous person who'll do them the best deal. When there are real ethical problems with taking that approach. But then it's also challenging to think about having to negotiate with all of the many different Indigenous groups where this plant might grow. So we've got to think of, again, how you deal with that. I don't think anyone's dealing with that adequately. But if a plant only grows in one particular location, then maybe you can identify one particular Indigenous group, but you do have to think about those other situations, which are probably much more common, where you've got lots of different groups, and how you're going to ethically approach commercializing something like that. That's one that I find quite challenging. So on Cape York, I've had some interaction with, say, the Cape York Land Council, but then you have interactions with individual groups, and then you've got interactions with the government, which are quite disconnected from that. So I don't going to have an answer, but I share your concern about the issue.
Okay, well, unless is there any other questions? Because it's just gone 1 o'clock.
Yep.
Okay, well, let's thank Robert again.
Thank you.
With our hand clapper.
Very good. Thank you.
And yeah, so thank you very much, Robert.
See you next time.
Thank you to everybody who participated in the seminar.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.